On December 18th, 2025 at 10:05 a.m., a Cessna 550 Citation 2 departed Statesville Regional Airport in North Carolina, carrying 7 people bound for Florida. Among them, former NASCAR driver Greg Biffle, his wife Christina, and their children. 10 minutes after takeoff, while climbing through 4,300 feet, a passenger sent a text message, "Emergency landing." Christina texted her mother, "We're in trouble." The aircraft turned back. It never made it. All 7 died in the crash. I've studied the flight track, the timeline, those final text messages. Here's what haunts me. In a Cessna Citation, passengers sit just feet from the cockpit. They could see the instruments, hear the discussions, feel the aircraft's behavior. Those messages tell us the emergency was obvious, immediate, and terrifying. But what did they see that made them reach for their phones? The morning of December 18th, 2025, was cold and overcast in Statesville, North Carolina, a small city about 50 miles north of Charlotte. Conditions at Statesville Regional Airport included drizzle and low clouds, typical December weather in the region, marginal but within legal operating limits. The airport is uncontrolled, meaning there's no control tower. Pilots self-announce their intentions on a common traffic advisory frequency. The Cessna 550 Citation 2, registered as N257BW, was a business jet first manufactured in 1981, making it 44 years old at the time of the accident. The Citation 2 is a light business jet capable of seating up to 10 people with a maximum range of about 1,500 nautical miles and a service ceiling of 43,000 feet. And it's powered by 2 Pratt & Whitney JT-15D turbofan engines mounted on the rear fuselage. The aircraft was owned by GB Aviation Leasing, a company registered to Greg Biffle. On board were 7 people. Pilot Dennis Dutton, his son Jack Dutton, Craig Wadsworth, and the Biffle family. Greg, 55, a former NASCAR driver who competed in the Sprint Cup Series and won 19 races during his career. His wife Christina, their daughter Emma, 14, and their son Ryder, 5. The flight plan was straightforward. A short hop from Statesville to Sarasota-Bradenton International Airport in Florida. A flight time of about 90 minutes under normal conditions. This was a personal trip, likely a family vacation given the timing just before the holidays. 3 people on board held pilot certificates, though investigators have not yet confirmed who was acting as pilot in command that morning. What seemed like a routine departure from a familiar airport would, within minutes, transform into a desperate fight for survival. Everything looked normal, until it wasn't. At approximately 10:05 a.m. local time, the Citation began its takeoff roll on runway 10 at Statesville Regional Airport. Runway 10 is oriented to the east, meaning the aircraft would initially climb out in that direction. Standard procedures for a Citation 2 takeoff include advancing the throttles smoothly to maximum thrust, monitoring engine parameters as airspeed increases, calling V1, the decision speed beyond which the crew is committed to flight, around 100 knots, and rotating at approximately 110 knots depending on aircraft weight. Then the Citation lifted off and entered its initial climb. Based on typical departure procedures and the flight track data available, the aircraft made an initial left turn to the west, beginning what would normally be a climbing turn to establish the aircraft on course toward Florida. The engines were producing normal thrust. The aircraft was climbing at a rate consistent with its performance specifications. From the cockpit, the crew would have been executing their after-takeoff checklist: positive rate, gear up, airspeed alive, flaps up, establish climb power, and trim for the climb. But somewhere in those first few minutes after departure, something changed. Flight tracking data shows the aircraft reached a maximum altitude of 4,300 feet, less than a mile above the airport elevation. For a flight to Florida, this altitude is far too low. A normal climb profile would have had the Citation passing through 10,000 feet within 5 to 7 minutes, continuing to its cruise altitude in the mid-30,000-foot range. Instead, the aircraft made a second left turn back toward the east, reversing course. This was not part of the flight plan. This was an emergency return. The decision to return to the airport indicates the crew recognized a serious problem that required immediate landing. In aviation, the calculus is straightforward. You only give up altitude, your energy reserve, your safety margin, when continuing flight is more dangerous than landing immediately. Turning back means abandoning your destination, accepting the risks of a rushed approach with potential system failures, and committing to a landing that may not be under optimal conditions. Seeing sometime during this turn back toward Statesville, passengers in the cabin became aware of the emergency. One passenger sent a text message, "Emergency landing." Christina Biffle texted her mother, "We're in trouble." These messages are significant not just for their content, but for their timing. In the compact cabin of a Citation II, passengers sit within a few feet of the cockpit. The cabin is not separated by a door in many configurations. Passengers can hear cockpit conversations, see instrument panels, observe the pilot's body language, and feel every change in the aircraft's attitude and power settings. What would make passengers send those messages? The aircraft's behavior would have been noticeably wrong. Perhaps a descent rate that felt too steep. Maybe unusual engine sounds, a change in pitch, a reduction in power, or asymmetric thrust. The turn back toward the airport would have been obvious. Passengers familiar with the route would have known they were heading the wrong direction, and they would have seen or heard the crew's urgency. Checklists being run, radio calls being made, switches being thrown. The cockpit would have been a scene of intense, focused activity. According to NTSB investigators, the Citation was attempting to land on runway 28, the opposite direction from its departure runway, when it crashed. This makes sense. The winds or the aircraft's position at the time of the emergency would have made runway 28 the logical choice. But the aircraft never reached the runway surface intact. The first impact was with a runway light stand located approximately 1,800 feet before the runway threshold, over a third of a mile short of where the aircraft needed to be. This indicates the Citation was descending far below its intended glide path, either because it lacked the power to maintain altitude or because it was uncontrollable. After striking the light stand, the aircraft continued its trajectory, hitting trees, striking 2 additional runway light stands, and impacting the runway perimeter fence before coming to rest and erupting in flames. All 7 occupants died in the crash. The fire was immediate and intense, fueled by the remaining jet fuel on board. First responders arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. The families in Florida who were expecting the Biffles' arrival received word instead of an unthinkable tragedy. The NASCAR community, which had known Greg Biffle for decades, was stunned. And investigators from the NTSB descended on Statesville to begin the painstaking work of determining what had gone so catastrophically wrong in just 10 minutes of flight. The data tells us what happened. The question is why. The leading theory centers on a propulsion system failure, either a complete engine failure or a significant loss of power in one or both engines. The Citation II is a twin-engine aircraft, and while it can theoretically fly on one engine, the performance penalty is severe, especially at low altitude with heavy weight immediately after takeoff. If one engine failed during the initial climb, the crew would have experienced an immediate yaw, the aircraft's nose pulling toward the dead engine, and a loss of climb performance. Standard procedures call for identifying the failed engine, confirming it with throttle and instrument checks, securing the engine by shutting off fuel and pulling the fire handle if necessary, and adjusting the remaining engine's power and the rudder trim to maintain directional control. But in a Citation II departing at or near maximum takeoff weight, single-engine performance may not provide enough thrust to continue climbing or even maintain altitude. The decision to return would have been immediate and unavoidable. The aircraft would need to land as soon as possible, and Statesville, the departure airport familiar to the crew with a runway they'd just used successfully, would be the obvious choice. The challenge: completing the turn, managing the descent, configuring the aircraft for landing, and executing the approach, all while operating with degraded performance and possibly dealing with secondary failures cascading from the primary problem. A second possibility involves control system failure or structural damage. If a flight control surface failed, an elevator, aileron, or rudder, or if there was damage to a control linkage, the aircraft's controllability would be compromised. The Citation II uses a conventional cable and pulley control system for primary flight controls, with hydraulically boosted systems for some functions. Evidence that might support this theory includes the aircraft's flight path during the return. Were the turns coordinated and smooth or erratic and unstable? Yet did the aircraft maintain a consistent descent rate, or did it oscillate in altitude and airspeed? The NTSB has recovered multiple cockpit instruments and the Garmin G750 display system, which may contain recorded data about control inputs and aircraft responses. A control problem could also explain why the aircraft struck the ground short of the runway. If the crew was fighting an unresponsive or partially responsive control system, they might have been unable to maintain the precise glide path required to reach the runway. An approach that looks normal from a distance can deteriorate rapidly if the pilots cannot fine-tune their descent rate or make small corrections to their flight path. The trees and light stands the aircraft struck suggest a shallow but uncontrolled descent. Not a dive. How about a gradual loss of altitude that the crew could not arrest? A third theory, less discussed but worth serious consideration, involves spatial disorientation or a decision-making error under extreme stress. The weather that morning included drizzle and low clouds, conditions that, while legal for flight, reduce visibility and eliminate visual references to the horizon. If the crew was focused on managing an emergency, their attention might have been drawn inside the cockpit to instruments and checklists away from outside visual cues in IMC, instrument meteorological conditions. Pilots must trust their instruments completely, but in a high workload emergency, especially if there are conflicting indications from failed or malfunctioning instruments, it's possible to lose situational awareness. The crew might have believed they were higher than they actually were, or that their descent rate was shallower than reality. This theory would explain the approach path, a gradually descending trajectory that looked stable from the cockpit's instruments, but was, in fact, well below the safe approach profile. It would also explain why the crew didn't recognize the danger until it was too late to recover. The trees and light stands would have appeared suddenly through the drizzle, too late for any corrective action. This is the kind of scenario that requires immediate recognition and aggressive action. Pull up, add power, go around. But if the crew didn't realize they were that low, those actions wouldn't come in time. When I look at the totality of the evidence, the emergency return, the text messages indicating passenger awareness, and the short flight path, the impact well short of the runway, I believe the most likely scenario involves a propulsion system problem, possibly compounded by decision-making under extreme pressure. The aircraft's behavior suggests a loss of power or thrust that made continued flight impossible and created a situation where the crew had to return immediately, accepting all the risks that entails. The text messages are particularly telling. For passengers to send those messages, the emergency must have been obvious and serious. This wasn't subtle turbulence or a minor warning light. This was something passengers could see, hear, or feel. An engine failure, unusual sounds, erratic flight behavior, or visible smoke or fire. The fact that Christina sent a message to her mother saying we're in trouble suggests she understood the gravity of the situation. The NTSB investigation will focus on several key areas. Engine examination to determine if there was mechanical failure or foreign object damage. Fuel system analysis to rule out fuel starvation or contamination. Cockpit voice recorder playback to understand the crew's situational awareness and decision-making. And flight data to reconstruct the aircraft's performance throughout the 10-minute flight. But there's something else that's been bothering me about those final moments. Inside the cockpit, during that emergency return, the workload would have been crushing. Emergency procedures in a Citation 2 for an engine failure require immediate action. Identify the failed engine, confirm it, secure it. I'll adjust power and trim, maintain directional control, and simultaneously begin planning the return while communicating with the airport and configuring the aircraft for landing. But there's another layer of complexity. Passengers in the cabin. 3 of those passengers were children, including a 5-year-old boy. The crew would have been acutely aware that their actions were determining not just their own fate, but the survival of a family. That kind of pressure can sharpen focus, but it can also create tunnel vision or rush decision-making. The decision to return was correct. When you have an emergency, you land as soon as possible, but the execution of that return requires precise energy management. The aircraft must trade altitude for distance, configuring at the right moments, maintaining the right airspeed, staying on the correct glide path. If the approach is unstable, if the aircraft is too high, too fast, too slow, or off the center line, the standard procedure is to go around. Add power, climb away, and try again. But if you don't have the power to go around, or if you don't recognize the approach is unstable until too late, the window for recovery closes quickly. The Cessna Citation 2 is a first-generation business jet that first flew in 1978. While the design is considered reliable and has a long service history, these aircraft are now approaching or exceeding 40 years of age. Maintenance becomes increasingly critical as airframes and systems age. Metal fatigues, wiring degrades, seals fail, and components that were designed for a certain service life are pushed beyond their intended limits. N257BW was 44 years old. It had accumulated tens of thousands of flight hours over its operational life. The NTSB will examine maintenance records meticulously. When were the engines last inspected or overhauled? Were there any deferred maintenance items? Had there been previous issues with this aircraft that might provide clues to what failed? The investigation will also examine who was flying. 3 people on board held pilot certificates, determining who was the pilot in command, What their recent flight experience included and whether they were current and proficient in the Citation 2 will be critical to understanding the human factors. Different pilots have different risk tolerances, different decision-making styles, and different levels of proficiency with emergency procedures. The CVR, which has been recovered, you should provide definitive answers about who was flying and what they were dealing with during those final minutes. The broader context of this accident raises questions about owner-operated aircraft. When individuals own their own planes, especially high-performance jets like Citations, they operate under Part 91 of the Federal Aviation Regulations, general operating rules that are far less restrictive than the commercial operations rules under Part 135 or the airline rules under Part 121. Under Part 91, there's no requirement for a dispatcher to independently assess whether a flight should be conducted. There's no chief pilot providing oversight of individual flight decisions. The maintenance program is less rigorous than commercial standards, and while pilots must meet certain currency requirements, there's more flexibility in how and when those requirements are met. This isn't to suggest that owner-operated aircraft are unsafe.
Just over
Millions of flights are conducted safely under Part 91 every year. But when something goes wrong, there are fewer redundant safety layers to catch it. A commercial operation might have caught a maintenance issue during a more frequent inspection. A chief pilot might have questioned a decision to depart in certain weather conditions. A dispatcher might have provided an independent risk assessment. In owner-operated aviation, those decisions rest entirely with the pilot in command. The pressure to complete a flight can also be different.
Include multiple
That plane crashed while trying to return to the Statesville Airport on December 18th. According to the federal report, the plane developed multiple electrical and instrument problems shortly after takeoff.
The pilot, Dennis Dutton, and his adult son, Jack, were in the front seat, and Jack had control of the plane at some point.
Identify a maintenance issue before flight, recognize a developing emergency earlier, execute a go-around when an approach becomes unstable, and 7 people go home safely. For pilots, especially those operating owner-flown aircraft, this accident offers several critical lessons. First, know your aircraft's limitations. If you're flying a 40-year-old jet, understand what can fail and how those failures manifest. Study the emergency procedures, not just to pass check rides, but to internalize them so that when seconds count, your response is automatic. Second, brief every flight as if an emergency will happen. Before every takeoff, especially from shorter runways or in marginal weather, discuss what you'll do if something fails. At what point do you continue straight ahead? At what altitude can you safely turn back? What's your minimum safe altitude for the return approach? Having those numbers and decisions predetermined reduces your workload when the emergency actually occurs. Third, stay ahead of the aircraft.
The flight was heading to Florida when it turned around less than 10 minutes after takeoff and hit several trees before crashing.
If you're too high, too fast, or not aligned, go around. If you can't go around because of power limitations, that tells you the approach must be perfect the first time, which means slowing down your decision-making to ensure accuracy. Finally, practice. Emergency procedures and simulators feel different from real emergencies, but the muscle memory you develop in training is what saves you when adrenaline floods your system and time compresses. 7 people died on December 18, 2025. Greg Biffle, whose NASCAR career spanned nearly 2 decades and who was known for his competitive spirit and his love of aviation. Christina Biffle, his wife. Emma Biffle, 14 with her whole life ahead of her. Ryder Biffle, just 5 years old. Dennis Dutton, the pilot. Jack Dutton, Dennis's son. And Craig Wadsworth. They were heading to Florida for what should have been a joyful family trip, a break before the holidays. In those final minutes, passengers reached out to loved ones, not with panic, but with information. Emergency landing. We're in trouble. Those messages speak to both the terror of the situation and the human need to connect, to let family know what was happening. The recipients of those messages had to live with the knowledge that their loved ones knew they were in danger and could do nothing to help. The NTSB investigation will take at least a year to complete. A preliminary report detailing the factual circumstances will be released within 30 days, but the full analysis determining probable cause will take much longer. When that report arrives, it will provide definitive answers about what failed, why it failed, and what could have prevented this tragedy. We owe these 7 people more than answers. We owe them prevention. The fragility of flight, that even experienced pilots in well-maintained aircraft can face situations where seconds separate success from catastrophe, demands our humility, our vigilance, and our commitment to learning from every accident. Understanding what happened in those 10 minutes and especially in those final moments when passengers knew they were in trouble, might provide insights that save future lives. This channel will continue to follow the investigation and provide updates as the NTSB releases findings.